So last week when I was getting my Bible ready for the People of the Book sermon, where Pastor Melissa asked us to bring Bibles to share some information about, as I was preparing for that, I picked up my Bible from seminary, and also that was blessed at my ordination, that I had in my nightstand. And as I was going through it, I found a letter tucked inside. And so I sat down on the bed and I started to read that letter. And it was a letter from 12 or 13 years ago, a letter of encouragement from an old friend. And I thought for a moment how wonderful and awesome that made me feel. Even though this was an old letter from the past, right there in the present, it was making me feel encouraged all over again. And I thought, why don't we do this? Why don't we send letters and notes and handwritten cards to folks more often, if that is indeed the effect? Well, letter writing is a lost art. So much so that there was a group from The Guardian in England that did a letter writing campaign, or a letter writing experiment, more likely, or more aptly called. John McGregor was in charge of that group, and what he did was he put an all call out throughout the whole world for people to write them letters, and gave the address for them to send old-fashioned letters or cards to them. And then they started to eventually receive these letters and read these letters. And lots of fascinating things came out of these letters in terms of the way they were written, whom they were written from, the settings they were written in, and all sorts of information that was relayed through the letters. I have a piece from the article I was reading from John McGregor, where he's juxtaposing email with letter writing. He says the wonderful thing about email is that it's immediacy. A conversation can be had, a decision made, a plan refined in a matter of minutes, no matter where in the world the two parties happen to be. A letter, by contrast, always arrives from the past. There is a waiting, a forced patience built into the mechanics. You wait for a letter to arrive. You wait for a reply. In the time that it takes for a letter to reach a destination, anything can happen. Minds can be changed. Loves can be discovered. Lives can be lost. A beautiful way to think about the art of letter writing and receiving. Correspondence, the old-fashioned way. Well, the New Testament, our Bibles, the New Testament, if it weren't for letters, if it weren't for correspondence, most of our New Testament wouldn't exist. They are, in fact, letters, most of the books. The Apostle Paul is responsible for many or most of them. And we thought it would be fun to take a month to look at several letters that maybe we don't spend as much time with as the others. And we're calling this To Whom It May Concern. The church in our tradition calls these letters the pastoral letters. And these are letters that are written not to groups of people like the Church of Corinth or the Church of Ephesus, but particular people. In this case, pastors Timothy and Titus. And so the Apostle Paul is taking on the task of writing them letters in their pastoral situations. So, first of all, we want to look at Paul and Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and we're going to look at their relationship a little bit here together. Paul and Timothy go way back to Paul's first missionary trip to modern-day Turkey, a place called Lystra, where Timothy grew up with his mother, Eunice, and his mother Eunice was a Hebrew woman, a Jewish person, and then his Greek Gentile father. And so he had a mixed home in terms of religion as far as that goes. Paul visits this town. It does not go well. In fact, he's almost stoned to death. He's left for dead his first go-round in this area. But the gospel does stick. In fact, Eunice and Lois, who was Timothy's grandmother, were both converted. And so Timothy was impacted by this at a young age. And so now this young man who has grown up knowing the Hebrew Scriptures is also now being exposed to this new faith in terms of faith in the Messiah, in terms of Christianity. And he starts to grow up and mature in the faith. And so by the time Paul comes back to this town the second time in his second missionary journey, Timothy has become a leader in the church there in Lystra. Paul and Timothy become great friends and colleagues. As Barnabas and Paul split and go their separate ways, Timothy kind of steps in and takes over as his right-hand man. They go all over the Roman Empire together. In fact, Timothy becomes, along with Paul, they are the first two Christians to set foot in Europe. And so they do all that work together as well. Somewhere along the way, Timothy becomes pastor of Ephesus and the church in Ephesus. And he was still traveling and itinerant and all over the place, but Ephesus was his home base. And in this town, this important town in the early part of the church, we have Timothy settled and leading, and things are not going well. In fact, that's how we get letters in the New Testament. Is usually things are not going well, and Paul or someone else sets off and writes a letter. In this case, what we can determine and what we can discover is somehow Timothy has gotten word out to Paul, and maybe Timothy himself sent a letter and wrote a letter. And basically what it would have said to Paul is, "Hello, Paul, this is Timothy, I quit." He was that frustrated. He was frustrated and he was discouraged because it was a tough time to be the church. It was in the beginning, and we're actually at a crossroads, and it's against all odds that the church is actually going to survive. And certainly there were some outside factors, the Roman government, the Jewish leadership, that kind of made things difficult for the new church. But particularly and specifically what's bothering Timothy and what's hampering his cause is from within. And so it's Christians acting poorly or badly. And so there are going to be some things in this letter that Paul addresses in terms of what's going on with these so-called false teachers, is what we hear from Paul. As there's some false teachers that are making it difficult for the Christians there, making Timothy's work as a pastor difficult. And so Timothy is ready to quit. You don't have to memorize this list, and actually we'll get into it a little bit as we go on in the coming weeks. But there were at least 6 things that were going on that are kind of interesting in terms of these false teachers. And so if you can just imagine for a moment Timothy taking a break, or going to take a nap, or going for a walk, or maybe just going away for the weekend to help Paul somewhere else. And every time he would do it, these false teachers would come in and they would take over the group, and they'd teach about things like this: Gnostic elitism. And basically that's a fancy way of saying there was a group of people that thought they had some kind of secret revelation from God that only they were smart enough to know, and then they wanted the people to follow them in order to get that secret knowledge. There was a group of people that rejected the bodily resurrection. They said that, what you hear from Paul and the other apostles about resurrection on the last day is actually false. Why would we want our bodies, these bodies that are in poor condition, they're breaking down, why would we want them in the last day? It's just our soul that's resurrected. There was a third group that followed the law to a T, and not just the law of Moses, but the oral law too, and they made it very difficult for people. They said, if you're going to be a Christian, you have to follow the law to a T, and even beyond, and they were trying to get people to do that. And then there was the opposite, people that said, hey, you don't have to do anything in terms of changing your life. God doesn't care about how you behave. Grace is not just free, it's cheap. Just say yes to Jesus, and you don't have to change or have your life changed. And then there was a group that followed the myths and the genealogies. In other words, strange stories that were being circulated, plus The genealogies were, if you were part of the family, you were in. If you weren't part of the family, you were out. And so every time he turned around. And then my favorite group were the controversialists. And these were just people that speculated about any particular topic. And every time Timothy would turn his back, they would come in and they would just try to needle people to try to get them into a controversy, as if there weren't already enough controversies. They'd make some up. And so Timothy's discouraged and basically wants to quit. And so Paul gets word of this, and he writes them this letter. He writes him a letter of encouragement. And this encouragement takes the form of 1 Timothy. The first thing that we see here is Paul, after introducing himself or the letter saying this letter is from me, he says, when I left for Macedonia, I asked you. Well, actually the Greek word is stronger than ask. I urgently plead, or the word besought. I besought you. I beseech you to stay. And so it's much more urgent than just asking. He's pleading. He's saying, you have to stay here in order to combat the false teachers. So right off the bat, he's saying, you got to stay. You can do this. We need you there. You can't let these false teachers run you out of town. And so it's a very big deal, very important to the cause. And then he goes on and he lays out a few things that the false teachers are doing. They are getting people to pay attention to these useless myths, these endless genealogies. Then he goes on to say their teaching only causes guessing games instead of faithfulness to God's way of doing things. The goal of instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And so he lays that out for him. Then he goes on, expands on some of the behaviors. And then at the end of this first chapter is where we really get what Paul is trying to accomplish here in this letter. And that is, this is a letter of encouragement. And so he encourages Timothy with these words. Timothy, my child, I'm giving you these instructions based on the prophecies that were once made about you. So if you follow them, you can wage a good war, because you have faith. Because you have faith and a good conscience. That's coming back. Some people have ruined their faith because they refuse to listen to their conscience, such as Hymenaeus and Alexander. So he calls them out. I've handed them over to Satan so that they can be taught not to speak against God. And so that's the meat and the heart of this initial encouragement part of the letter, and he's giving it over to Timothy to encourage him to stay there and fight the good fight. And he's saying, you've got it in you. And this letter takes hold right from the beginning and starts to fill Timothy with that encouragement and love, reminding him of the grace of God. It's because of the grace of God that he can do this and that he can stay there and do this work. And so with this, we come back to this letter writing project by the Guardian and John McGregor. At the end of this article that I read, he starts to quote a postal worker that had sent in a letter. His name was Ken Sears. He says, Ken writes about the letters he sorted during his career and how he learned to spot the ones from prison, from lovers, from the person with hypergraphia, or people behaviorally compelled to write, and about how now in retirement, despite a lifetime of seeing most of the mail he sorted as just so much landfill, he could continue to write letters, and he does. Because it's a big, cold universe, and it feels just a little warmer believing there's somebody out there, somewhere, who knows you're still alive. And I just love that, because that's what Paul did for Timothy. He knew Timothy was out there feeling like it was a big, cold universe, and that he was all alone. And it was a cold, hateful environment that he was in. And so Paul sends this letter of encouragement right on time and reminds Timothy that he's not alone, and that Paul knows he's still there, and he's imploring that he stays there. He knows and he tries to encourage him to stay fighting the good fight, and he does that with this letter. And so with that, I'm going to give you some homework. On top of the homework Pastor Melissa has given you to read the whole Bible for the summer, this week's homework is to write a letter of encouragement. a handwritten note. No text, no Snapchat, no Facebook Messenger, no phone call, an actual letter that you write to someone in the form of encouragement. Writing them to encourage them along the way. And I think that would be a terrific response to this 1 Timothy chapter 1 and this message today, if writing a letter. And it's not only going to affect the receiver and fill them with encouragement and reminders that they're not alone, it's also going to change you and I as well and have an effect on us. May God add His blessing to this reading in the name of Jesus. Amen.